Bari, it's so great to have you here.
I'm so happy to be here.
I've been a groupie for a while, so I just am such a fan of the work that you're doing, the platform you're building. It's such an important voice.
Thank you.
But, so we want to hear it, Drummond. I'm kidding. So let's back up a little bit. Talk about, you grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. What was it like growing up there, and what was sort of your experience there, and how's that shaped who you are?
Well, I grew up literally in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. I grew up about a mile away from where he lived. Grew up in Squirrel Hill, and the oldest of 4 daughters. Probably the most relevant thing, especially to this crowd, is that I grew up in what's becoming an endangered species. I grew up the product of a politically mixed marriage. My dad, a conservative, my mom, a liberal. She withheld sex in 2016 to make sure that he wouldn't vote for Trump. He ended up writing in Steph Curry, so it was successful. And you know, it was the Liz Estrada moment of my family. So I grew up in a family where we were very comfortable debating ideas. That was something, and ideas and fighting about ideas didn't mean that you didn't love someone. Yeah. It was very possible to disagree with someone's ideas and love their identity, which is, I think, something that we're increasingly losing in today's culture. So that's the kind of family I grew up in, where we were constantly debating ideas. I didn't really have any sense of what I was going to be when I grew up. My dad sold carpet. You know, he wanted to have been a stand-up. You know, so it was unclear to me that, like, you could even be a journalist. Like, I didn't know anyone really that did that. And then through a very crazy sort of sequence of events, I ended up getting to the Wall Street Journal, and sort of the rest is history.
Yeah. Well, a data point that we shared last night is 81% of people today won't date somebody of a different political party. You know, 81%. And it's 23% won't date somebody from a different religion. So it's like amazing how polarized society has become.
Oh, you can, I mean, I know so many stories of people that just show me their Raya or their Hinge or whatever, and it's like, if you're a Republican, swipe whatever the wrong way is. Thank God I'm married. I haven't been on an app for a little while.
Well, and you've been through quite a whirlwind in the last couple of years. So you quit your job, you got remarried, moved from New York to the West Coast, started a job, and had a
We had a baby. I left I sort of upended my life. You know, for those in this room who have no concept of who I am, I've been a journalist for a long time. I was at the Wall Street Journal editorial page. I was sort of the token liberal on a conservative editorial page, always slightly out of step there, but broadly comfortable. That all changed in the run-up to the 2016 election, where the kind of same civil war that was happening broadly in the Republican Party and the conservative movement happened inside the Wall Street Journal editorial page. And the upshot of it was a lot of people ended up leaving. I ended up going to the New York Times, which sort of for a brief moment had a sense that maybe they weren't actually the paper of record. Maybe they weren't actually capturing the country as it was, because anyone from that night will remember the infamous needle, right? It was 99.9% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And yet my mom...
Nate Silver still has a job.
Right, and yet my mom in Pittsburgh, like, who for her work has to drive, 2 hours outside of the city, was calling me and saying, this guy is gonna win. Like, Trump is gonna win. I see these barns painted 12 feet high with his name. Like, people love this guy. Why isn't the media covering it in the way that I'm seeing it? So anyway, I got to the New York Times, and suffice it to say, it was a very, very interesting place to work. It was, from the beginning there, I was considered, it was hilarious. I went from being sort of the most left-leaning person in a conservative editorial page to the right of Attila the Hun in the context of the New York Times, which was amazing considering, like, I'm a Jewish lesbian from, like, Midwest. I don't know, the whole thing was kind of strange. But that's what it was. And, I'm really, really thick-skinned. And like I said, based on the context I grew up in, I'm very comfortable being in a politically disagreeable environment. But ultimately, I decided to leave the New York Times because I felt that it wasn't possible for me any longer to sort of take intellectual risks there. It was at the height of the sort of summer of 2020 and the very, very intense I would say, almost panicked political moment that led to that very, very heated up summer. And I ended up deciding to leave. I wrote this letter. It was kind of my Jerry Maguire moment. If you haven't read it, it's the only thing that's going to be in my obituary, so you can look it up after this.
It's definitely one of the most famous resignation letters of all time. So
yeah, it was definitely famous, and everything in there I stand by. And all of a sudden, I found myself for the first time without a job, without a plan, without even like an email list to get people to sign up for. And I spent the coming few months drinking a lot and wondering what was going to come next. And here I am 2 years later, building my own media company called The Free Press, being a first-time entrepreneur, employing 20 people and growing by the day. And so, you know, a lot's changed.
So talk about the Free Press. It's awesome.
Thank you.
Talk about kind of what got you going to do it, and how's it going, and what are you looking to accomplish?
Well, my wife, who I met at the New York Times, we met because I was sort of perceived as the black sheep already. You know, this was a few years into my being there. She was very much in the in crowd. She covered business and technology, and we were going to meet so she could set my politics straight. Anyway, we wound up married, and we're running this business together, so I won, I guess. Well, I got her, so I won. But in any case, the proposition of the Free Press is pretty simple. We believe in journalism that treats people like adults. We believe in journalism that tells people about the world as it actually is. We believe in excellence in storytelling and great reporting. And so what we're trying to do is sort of marry the high quality excellence that you expect to get in a paper like the New York Times and the Washington Post, and marrying that to the political freedom of what I think of as sort of like the Wild West world. The great thing about the world of podcasting and YouTubing and all of that stuff is anyone can do it. That's incredible, and it's incredible the way it's sort of like democratized information. The bad part of it is there's no gatekeeping and there's no fact checking. And so we're trying to sort of be the bridge between the old world and the new, and we just believe that the audience for people that are seeking old school journalism is enormous. We actually think it's the vast majority of the country.
Absolutely.
And I think most people kind of hate the fact that when they turn on cable news at night, their choices are, you know, like Tucker Carlson or, you know, whoever the big person is on MSNBC these days, Lawrence O'Donnell. Like,
right.
That's not a great option. Like, there should be a third way, and there should be something that suits, I think, where I certainly am, which is like the politically homeless, you know, the radical centrist, whatever you call the thing that makes you kind of repelled by the idea that you need to be part of one tribe or another, and you need to sort of fit into a box and necessarily be opposed to whoever's in the other box. I just don't think that's where most people are, and we really we try and take things issue by issue, and we pay a special attention, and then I'll shut up, to the kind of stories that are either overlooked or distorted by the mainstream press. And frankly, we got a lot of our momentum early on because we were covering stories about education and what was happening in the world of education.
Well, you know, I knew who you were for a while, but when you wrote the Harvard Westlake story, I did become a groupie because it was so good. It was so important.
Thank you.
Talk about what you learned. And if you haven't read that article, you need to read it because it's absolutely spectacular. Talk about what prompted you to do it and what you learned, because it was quite a process, and you were kind of interviewing people West Coast, East Coast, and it was eerily the same, you know, craziness. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think there's two things to say. I think, you know, back in my first job at the Wall Street Journal, my boss was Paul Gigot, and he basically sat me down. I was like 22 years old and was like, Bari, no one gives a shit what you think about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Like, we don't need another op-ed about a thing everyone has an opinion on. What you can do, and this is my advice always to young journalists, 90% new information, 10% perspective, which is like the opposite of I think what most people in the world are doing right now. And so that was the rule of thumb that's led me through my entire career. That was the rule of thumb that led me to that story. that story fits into sort of like a big theme that I'm interested in, and that's the story of institutional capture. How is it that an institution that claims to be one thing, let's say most of higher education, right? Most of higher education claims to be in the pursuit of truth. Veritas, that is the word that is in all of these great school seals. And yet often it seems like the pursuit of truth is a secondary or a tertiary goal right now in a lot of higher education. Now we can debate what those other goals are, but I think we can sort of all see that sometimes the pursuit of truth is sublimated to those other goals, whether it's credentialing, whether it's identity politics, whether it's whatever it is. And so I'd been interested in that theme for a while, in part, frankly, because it's what I saw at the New York Times. How was it that the paper of record was sort of putting down its flag of being all the news that's fit to print? How had all the news that's fit to print become all the news that fits the convenient political narrative? How did that happen? And how is that same story playing out in so many aspects of American life? And what I noticed was that it was no longer just a story in the world of education that was happening in colleges. It was also happening in high schools. And not only was it happening in elite high schools, which are sort of the pathway to get into the Ivies and everything else, it was also happening in public schools, and oh my God, it was also happening in middle schools, and oh my God, did I hear about this elementary school that forced the kids in the school to line up according to privilege, at the taxpayer expense. What the hell's going on?
Right.
And so I felt that this was an extraordinarily important area for us to cover, because what could be more important than the way that we're educating our kids?
Well, I think you used the term woke weaning on that as sort of the bridge between the elite school and the Ivy League schools.
Yeah.
And I thought one of the things that just struck me in that was just how terrified people were to talk to you.
Oh my God. I mean, I was meeting, it's a funny thing to live in the freest society in the history of the world, and yet have some of the most privileged people in that society acting like they're in East Germany. And what it tells you is that prestige and popularity and fitting in matters a tremendous deal to us as social animals. That was something that I really underestimated, and I've sort of changed my priors. When I think about all that's changed in the past few years for me, one of them is how much I underestimated the power of that. And the idea that, you see something in your school that is wrong. And by the way, in some of these cases, the parents are spending like upwards of $50,000 a year for it. And yet, the idea that speaking out could maybe harm their chances of getting the most glowing possible letter from the college admissions person to allow their kid to go on to whatever the school brand name school is, that was something that was enormously powerful to people.
Talk about Austin University. So how did you get involved with that? What's sort of the thesis behind it? I mean, the negative people call it the anti-culture university, anti-cancel culture university, and it's supposed to be a dig. I think that, I don't know how that's a dig, but that's one of the digs people use against it. So talk about that.
Yeah, the big thesis of my life, and I think really I imagine of so many people in this room, is that it's a time to build. It's a time to build new things. When you're living in an era in which so many of the institutions that we thought were untouchable, that we thought were Teflon strong, are no longer that, what do we do in the face of it? Well, when possible, the thing we should do is rebuild and reform and fix those things, because God damn it, it is really, really hard to build new things, as I'm learning. But when you find, let's say in the example of the world of journalism, journalism's built on trust. If you lose trust, it's really hard to gain that back. And so my big thesis of my entire life is, if new things need to be built, how can I participate in doing that? And so once I left the Times, I sort of threw myself into a number of efforts, and those have sort of narrowed down to the Free Press, my company, and UATX, which is this university that you've referenced. The day that we announced it, and I don't know if he's in this room, but the head of it, this incredible guy who was running St. John's College, one of the great schools, decided to leave it to move to Austin, which is hotter than hell, in order to run this school. You should talk to him and ask him about why he decided to do that. I think he's incredible, Pano Canellis. I think we got 4,500 inquiries that day. It has been an outpouring unlike anything I think we could have anticipated. And the reason for it is very simple. People in this country are desperate for a university, not that's going to be the anti-woke or the anti-cancel culture university, not that's going to be reactionary, but that's actually going to sort of pick up the flag that so many of these institutions that have put down. That's actually going to put the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of truth over and above everything else. That's actually going to judge people, based on their intellect, based on their character. It's a simple proposition, but in our current context, I think it feels very radical to people. I think that's why it's caught such fire. And I'll say, as someone that has spoken to many, many groups of students all over the country, I've never been more intimidated than I was to teach at the summer school, because the students were just razor sharp and ready to debate and unafraid to debate, and all over the political spectrum. It was incredible, and I'm looking forward to going back there this summer. And we're gonna welcome our first freshman class in 2024, which has gone faster than I think any of us anticipated.
Another theme of your life is hating bullies and basically stand up against bullies. Talk about, because you've taken a lot of controversial things. And I've got pages and pages of them. But a lot of controversy. What allows you to kind of stick up and stand for what you believe is right?
So I don't know if anyone in this room has ever been what they call the main character of Twitter for the day. It is not a role you should sign up for. And I will say, having been the main character a few years ago, my emotional reaction to it is really different than what it is today. I would be lying if I didn't say that, getting trending in a bad way, it flattened me when it first happened. I could not get out of bed, really. Now, thankfully, I don't tend to be a depressive person, and I have a really supportive family, and who knows who I am and can separate out this caricature, in the way that social media, I think, flattens all of us and makes us into a caricature that can become unrecognizable. It's really difficult to contend with that, even if you're an adult. So imagine that happening, as it does every single day, to middle schoolers, to high schoolers. It's an unbelievable transformation that I don't think we yet have the software update as human beings to deal with yet. How do I deal with it now? First of all, having a child and a wife and a family that I adore that grounds me in the real world. And I think another part of it that has been transformative for me is just being extraordinarily clear with myself about what my life is about. And I know that may sound cheesy, but for me, it's been very true. I know that my life is not about being at the cool kids table. It's not. That is not important to me. What is important to me are a set of values that I just have as my North Star, and that allows me to do things that are marginally more courageous than other people. I think the other thing that is significant for me is having a sense of gratitude about the time and place that I live in. It never escapes me, even for a single day of my life, that my life, everything about it, sitting on this stage, wearing pants, having my hair exposed, being married to a woman, walking down the street, being affectionate with her, being publicly out as a proud Jew, none of that would have been possible 2 generations ago. And none of that is possible in most places around the world right now. And so keeping that at the forefront of my heart and my mind also, I think, grounds me. And so the word courage has been used to describe me. I'm courage is like Masih Alinejad showing her hair, and leaving Iran. Courage, you want to look at courage, look to other places around the world. If what's courageous in our current cultural context is me leaving the New York Times and getting to start a new business of my own, like, sign me up. Like, and I think, I just think like one of the things that we're suffering from a lot in our culture, and I think social media, for all of the glories of the internet, and it's incredible, and it's allowed for so many things in my professional life. I think one of the things it's done is create almost a contagion of cowardice. And I think it's made being courageous very hard because everything we do is captured forever. And the room is not the room, right? Like, I'm not just talking to you. I'm talking to anyone that has a smartphone video that wants to film me making a weird hand gesture, take that out of context, and then ruin my life. So like, that's the context we're living in, and I think it shouldn't come as a surprise that people are showing tremendous amounts of cowardice. And I think one of the big questions, especially for educators and innovators, is to think about like, how can we incentivize courage? How can we model courage, especially for younger people?
100%. Talk about the Twitter files. How did you get brought into the Twitter files, and then what's happening with your relationship with Elon?
Oh, okay. I was sitting in my house in LA, seething. It was a Friday night, it was 6, I was sitting there, Nellie was here, we were holding the baby, and I saw that Matt Taibbi got the scoop. And I was really angry because I'm a competitive person, and I thought like, damn, that story should have been ours. 5 minutes later, I get a text on Signal from Elon Musk saying, how soon can you be at Twitter headquarters? And without skipping a beat, we just kind of stood up from our chairs, grabbed some underwear, grabbed some diapers for the baby, and we were on a plane 2 hours later. And we were in Twitter that night by midnight, and probably were there that first night for a few hours with Elon and 2 engineers that happened to be there. And it was surreal. I mean, the whole experience of pursuing that story was very exciting, very surreal. And it was important, I think, especially given how public it was, right? Usually what happens is a source comes to a journalist in private, and then that journalist can kind of go away, assess the information, and then come out with the story. In this case, the source was announcing that we had things like announcing that we had access to it on Twitter Spaces and on Twitter. And so the pressure became really intense. And I think it was very, very important throughout that story to remember our values, remember our standards, remember, that we don't answer ultimately to the source, we answer ultimately to the reader and the audience. And I'm extremely proud of the way that my team comported ourselves. For those who weren't following, and God bless you if you weren't, because it was crazy, all of the ins and outs of it, essentially Elon, who is probably the most interesting person, one of the most interesting people alive right now, love him or hate him, he's fascinating and very funny and interesting to be around, but bought Twitter on the promise of transparency and on the promise of free speech. And probably about 2 weeks, I forget exactly the timeline because I didn't sleep much in those 2 weeks, but he was sort of kicking off journalists from Twitter, and I privately asked him to not do that and suggested that that was hypocritical and the antithesis of his stated values, and ultimately ended up tweeting something about it because, again, I had to step back and say, if this wasn't a source, would I say something about it publicly? And the answer, of course, was yes. He was not very happy about it, ended up unfollowing us, which is, I guess, the ultimate neg. But I'm grateful to him. I'm grateful to him for opening up the Twitter files, and life is very long, and what he's doing with AI, with SpaceX, with Tesla are just stories that I'm going to continue to pursue. I'm also spoke a bunch to Walter Isaacson, who's writing a really interesting biography that I'm sure all of us in this room are eager to read.
And I could talk to you for the rest of the day, but unfortunately we run out of time. So I've got some rapid fire questions.
Oh, sure.
So 1 sentence response to each of them, okay? Who's your favorite interview ever?
Who I've interviewed?
Mm-hmm. Not me interviewing you.
Yeah, it's you. Probably the technologist, Jaron Lanier. Extremely interesting person.
Would you rather be interviewed or interview somebody?
Oh, I would always rather interview somebody.
You talked about your view on Elon Musk. How about Anthony Fauci?
Storied career, should have never told a noble lie.
Joe Rogan.
so much fun, has more power than he knows how to contend with.
So best book that you've read recently?
Oh my God, The Best Minds by Jonathan Rosen. It's the best book I've read in several years. It's coming out on the podcast today. It is the story of, well, that's more than one sentence. The Best Minds by Jonathan Rosen.
Best thing about LA?
The people.
But you miss New York.
New York is the greatest city in the world, but I love LA.
Last question. Can a third-party candidate or an independent win as the President of the United States?
In the current political landscape, unfortunately, no.
So, Bari Weiss, you are very brave. This is a brave new world, the theme of the conference. We're so privileged to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.